Okay, we're just starting hearing 28. Just to note that there are no submitters appearing today, but we're having a session with the reporting officer just to go through some questions and to seek an overview of the zone, so that when we go into deliberations, we'll be in good shape to consider those matters. Just to note for the record that the panel will consider all submissions that have been lodged. We do also have a tabled letter from Ministry of Education, who won't be appearing, but we have a tabled letter from them which we will also consider. All right. On that note, we have received officer's response to questions from the panel, which were sent out prior to the hearing, and we will go through that. But first of all, I'll just ask Mr. Beard, Ben Beard, who's the reporting officer, to give a very brief overview of the special purpose Maori purpose zone, and just to help people from out of town like myself as to where the zone's located, and basically how it works in terms of Maori land and general purpose or general land. So thank you very much, Mr. Beard, for doing that.
That's all good. Yeah, so the areas that are zoned from considered the ancestral land elements. They were identified in Kemp's deed back then, and so that the full area of those is zoned, and within that you then provide a distinction between the land classification. So the land classification comes from the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act, which identifies all land in New Zealand having a status as general land or Māori freehold land, Māori customary land, and that and so and it also established the Māori Land Court. So some of the Māori land that we were referring to within the special purpose zone is referencing the land that the Māori Land Court is kind of identified and is managing or administers. So they go through a process of bringing that into the Māori Land Court. They sort out who the ownership issues and help sort out development issues and such like. So the rules work from that, saying when a bit of land was identified in that Māori Land Court, that's considered Māori land, then the provisions are basically permitting of development under that scenario. When land does not meet that definition, it's considered general land, and then the zone essentially tries to replicate the rural provisions, so it links back to the rural chapter activity status. So if you were wanting to do some residential activity, if it's on the Māori land, then that's permitted. If it's on general land, then it's basically do you meet the rural provisions that it's linking to. So that's how it works, and it was set up that way so that when land is entered into the Māori Land Court at any moment throughout the plan's duration, that those provisions are therefore kind of automatically enabled, and we don't have to do a plan change to go through, identify the area again, and bring it through into that process.
And so in terms of the planning maps, is there anything on the planning maps to help, or is it just done, it's not shown on the planning maps, is that right?
It's not shown on the planning maps because otherwise you'd have to do a plan change to fix it. Yeah. So, but
it's sort of it's a notional zone sort of thing, isn't it? It's not the normal way of doing it in terms of industrial, commercial, rural. Is that right?
The Maori purpose zone is identified as another ancestral land, but yeah, the Māori land within it is not identified. Yeah. So that can change as it goes forward. Yeah.
Questions? In terms of the link to the rural zone provisions for the general land, I'm trying to understand in my own mind why it isn't just zoned to rural if the provisions are the same as rural.
It's just so that if that general land is then transferred into the Māori Land Court, then you're not having to change it again. So there will be land in the Māori purpose zone that is owned by whoever, and if that is brought or is it transferred into that Māori Land Court, then that is considered Māori land within the special purpose zone and then can use those provisions. So
there's no need to change the provisions. They're set up for that purpose. Yeah, as land becomes designated, if you like, for want of a better word. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, identified in that in the Māori Land Court maps. Yeah.
It's enough for me to understand the general principles. Does anyone have any questions about the way the zone works before we get into the questions themselves?
Yes.
Yep.
So just for clarification, we have Runanga land, right? We have sort of like around Mutakarara, Green Park Huts, Fisherman's Point. They're all considered Maori land court land. I'm just trying to clarify how big the catchment is, because some of the land would be in multiple ownership, right? So just trying to clarify, is that you said there's no planning maps, but would they be specific sites of interest, or would they be come under this Maori land court classification?
So there's two areas on the planning maps of special purpose, multi-purpose land. So that's around Taumutu area down there on the lake, and there's a little bit over behind Motu Kara, that's Ngaitua Hiri's land as well. And those are the only two spots that these provisions apply to. So there is potentially other land outside of those areas that could be considered Māori land, but these provisions don't relate to them. It's only the land that's in that zone, those two zoned areas, and those two areas are related to the areas identified as ancestral lands, kind of linked back to Kempstead. So if in the future, if there was some of those areas that wanted to kind of have these provisions, then we'd need to do a plan change to rezone that land as special purpose, multi-purpose, and then those provisions would apply. But currently, it's just those two pieces. Yeah. So yes, there will be land outside of those two areas that are Māori land, but these provisions do not relate to them.
I need to check in on a bit of that, and that is that the zoning, you're saying that the zoning is defined through the land classification through the Maori Land Court. Yes, what about auxiliary land, that in terms of, and I'm thinking in particular land like at Green Huts, that is designated in terms under the auxiliaries claim. That is multiple across all Papatipu within Canterbury. And I'm just wondering where that actually sits within this.
Yeah, so that wasn't included as special purpose, Māori purpose land, and it's not zoned that, so that these provisions don't relate to it. But yeah, you could do a plan change to bring that in. The original areas, the areas chosen is because the Canterbury Region Policy Statement talks about those ancestral lands, and to zone those for that, to enable Papakainga, etc. So that's where they've been focused, and the zone framework hopefully enables that land to supports a rezoning of that land to kind of meet those needs if that needs to be extended. And so that's probably another element of this framework, is to say this is a good structure that once those additional areas are identified and can come through, and that's something that the Runanga want, then that's a plan change that we can go through and rezone those areas to enable that development. And especially in some of those situations for Taumutu that you're facing significant hazards in the future, that they may want to be looking at another site in the long term. So once they've found that site, we can rezone that special purpose, multi-purpose, and then you've got the permitting development through the zone framework. But yeah, it starts off in just those original areas.
My questions are mainly around that, was around future development in terms of because of the natural hazards area with the 4 metre, that quite a bit will be lost in the assurance. So I was seeking that assurance that purchase, that you could obtain land, whatever means it might be, to enable papatapu or mana whenua, whānui, to be able to relocate, and how we're actually supporting that relocation within the plan.
Yeah, so those areas, once they're identified and purchased, they would have to go through a plan change to special purpose, Māori purpose, and that land would have to be administered through the Māori Land Court to enable those provisions. But there was many discussions about how do you expand these provisions and how it can work, and I think the other councils are looking at that as well. It's something you could look at to do into the future, but at the moment it's kind of these are the ones we know. These are the ones, there's no kind of certain other areas that we can say here it is and it applies here, therefore here's a good framework. We can look at doing a plan change in the future once we're a bit more certain about those kind of areas you want.
So then, just for clarification then, that this purpose, the zone purpose that we're actually looking at, are those two main designated sites, and that's what is covered within these provisions, but it also enables future development to go outside.
Yeah. So there's a policy about enabling the zone to be applied elsewhere. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, and thank you very much for answering the questions which I've been through. And in terms of the questions I asked, I'm happy with the response. Probably just a couple of clarification matters, and one is the potential for non-notification clauses. And you've replied there; it's on the second page, about halfway down. You've said that there's a potential to have non-notification clauses regarding tsunami policy overlay and the setback height and building coverage. So that would, if we were to agree with that, that would potentially help reduce the complexity of applications. And would you actually support those? Is that what you're doing here? You're supporting? I'm just saying it's something that could be looked at.
Probably the tsunami one is something that I wouldn't expect that would need any kind of notification anyway. So that would just be that the council is satisfied that has been considered. And the rule requirement setback ones is probably like I wouldn't expect any application to be notified wider than people around them anyway. So it could be limited to just the neighbour, and that's purely just because if you've got general land and Māori land, kind of you've got a bit of a difference in what is enabled. So you can kind of, it's just to make sure that those two things are kind of protected as you go.
Right. So yeah, because that's certainly coming through in a lot of the reports for different chapters. Is that there's a sort of a mix and match. Some matters that are fairly minor potentially are recommended for non-notification clauses, and others aren't. So those ones you've identified appear to be, if we were to accept that, it would be consistent with possibly the rural zone approach. Okay. All right. Now I've just got one other question. Thank you. You've responded to MOE's tabled letter right at the end, and I was going to ask you about that, but you've already addressed it. So I think what you're saying there is that Ministry of Education sort of restricted RDA status for education facilities in the zone generally, and the point you're making here seems to be that within the Maori land area, it would be that they would be permitted activities at schools and so forth. But in the balance of the zone, it would be the same as in the rural chapter, which is non-complying. Is that right? Yeah. Is that right? I've got it right.
I'd have to double check where the hearing got to on that, but it was notified as non-compliant.
Oh, yes, it was notified. Yes, okay.
Yeah, and I guess there is probably potential that there is a need for establishment of a school that can't fit on that Māori land, but I think probably a designation process is possible, rather than enabling an education facility throughout it.
So can you comment on the general principle of making educational facilities non-complying in zones generally, like industrial zone and rural? And is it to do with effects, or is it more to do with they should be in different zones from a amenity point? Or was that something you haven't been drawn into?
I hadn't been
Right.
thinking about that. It was probably more for the rural chapter to
No,
decide.
I wasn't on that hearing either, but I'm just curious whether it's an effects concern or whether it's a concern about almost where they should go from a using up valuable land type argument. But I don't know whether in terms of this zone, that certainly we have a submitter asking that they be restricted discretionary in the general part of it, and your answer is to be consistent with the rural zone, because that's the principle of this zone, isn't it? The general land is to be consistent with rural. Okay, understand that. All right, no, I've got no other questions of the things I raised, and I think Eva, you had a number of things, or Deborah, you go first. Yeah.
Is any of this land in a coastal environment covered by regional council, and therefore could be deemed the responsibility of the regional council? Is there a crossover with regards to the location of any of this land?
Well, no, the district plan provisions shouldn't be crossing into what's the CMA. So it's be a mapping issue if it does.
Just trying to understand where the coastal provisions some of the land, especially around you're looking at.
But there's different, I guess, to the coastal environment area, which is an area that we do map in terms of its natural character values, which is subject to a separate chapter and hearing.
Yeah, so all the hazard and coastal environment chapters still apply within that zone. So there is a tension in there that we have enabled that development, but if you're in a flood hazard area, you still need to make sure that you deal with that issue. It's not permitted, and ignore the hazards. So there is a tension and balance in there.
All right, thanks. Yvette, do you have your questions answered to your satisfaction?
Partly. The question around papakainga definition and just doing a check-in terms of multiple owned land, knowing the point of clarification that we're looking at those two land blocks, but also looking at future, because so what I was asking there, where you were saying that you were quite sure within that area, the definition within a reserve lands that are in the Māori land court, but within that there are pockets of whānau that have individual ownership within there. Some is through the land court, and yet some will be general. So what I'm asking is that if they are within that known historic land parcel, would the papakainga requirements be excluded for them if they have changed their title from Māori land over to general land? That's what I was meaning by that.
So
In some cases there could be, but they're still within that parcel.
Yeah, so this assumption is that whatever's mapped in them from Māori land court is how you work from it. So within a parcel, if some land is not and some land is, then I guess the provisions apply where it is identified as Māori land in the Māori land court, and relying on them to the court to be able to administer the issues around multiple ownership, and that's what they deal with. And it is my understanding that once land is Māori land in the Māori land court, then they try and make sure it doesn't go back out and become general land again. So there's kind of an expectation that it will stay Māori land. So yeah, that's how I see that working, and gives certainty to enabling provisions that on that Māori land. Yeah.
I'm not,
Yeah, so it kind of would rely that that stuff that happened in the 60s would be essentially reversed and put back as Māori land to provide that certainty that it's there for it's there for the intent of Māori land into the future. There's just the uncertainty about that general land that is owned by Māori, like the future of that there's no kind of control or restriction on who that can be sold to again. So that's just the framework is what happened back then, we kind of have to reverse that, but that was enabled then to try and get it back. I'm not sure if it's a massive issue in Selwyn. I think it's a bigger issue out Kaiapoi and Rapaki, possibly potentially more so. And I think those districts are working through a different definition or an expanded definition of Māori land to include that kind of thing. That's not what was proposed here, and that wasn't what Mahanui Kurutai put forward for this as well. So, but it can be looked at in the future. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beard. No further questions, and you're excused from having to do a reply report. It's possible the panel, after deliberating, might ask for some guidance on wording, but we'll come to that. But thank you very much. On that note, we'll adjourn this hearing 28. Thank you.